Henry VIII viewed himself as a pious Christian king. He viewed himself as a defender of the Christian faith and of traditional religion in England. He himself was a practitioner of traditional religion. He attended Mass, usually daily. He went on pilgrimages. He collected relics of saints. He seemed to have been an ideal, pious Christian king before his split with Rome. Henry is also very interested in upholding what he understands as the traditional rights of the Church of England, that it ought not to be subject to outside interference from the papacy excessively, for instance. This desire to protect the rights of the Church of England by the monarchy was actually a long-standing tradition in England. We can date this all the way back to the reign of Henry II and his conflict with Thomas Becket, for instance. This desire to uphold the rights of the Church of England at this point in time does not mean necessarily rejecting papal authority, but it does give a hint of where his biases and interests lie. This takes us to what is often called the King's Matter, this question of the annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and how he can attain a royal succession for his line by having a male heir. Henry VIII is unable to produce a male heir with Catherine of Aragon, and Henry becomes convinced that the issue is that his marriage itself to Catherine of Aragon is inappropriate. Catherine is of Spanish descent, as her title suggests. She is the wife of Henry's deceased elder brother, Arthur, and the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. So one of the things to keep in mind here is Henry was not initially meant to be King of England at all, rather his brother was. When his brother dies in an untimely accident, Henry, as just a teenager, I believe he's 18 or so, is pressed into marriage to his what was his sister-in-law, who herself is around 26 or so at the time of this marriage. Henry has come to believe that his marriage to Catherine was a sin, as it violates Leviticus chapter 20, verse 21, which states that a brother shall not marry the wife of his own brother. Contrast this, though, with Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5, which institutes what we call levirate marriage, where one is, as a male, obligated to marry the widow of a deceased brother. Henry comes down to believe that the Leviticus reading is the appropriate one, and because he has committed this sin, he's being punished by God by not having male heirs. So what he does is he seeks to get a dispensation from Pope Julius II to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. And this is what his chief advisor, Cardinal Wolsey, pursues in 1527. It's important to remember that he's not pursuing a divorce per se. Rather, he's trying to get an annulment. An annulment is actually a legal ruling by the church, the Pope here in this instance, that the marriage itself never actually existed. The key to the argument here that Wolsey needs to propose is that the Pope had no right in the first place to give a dispensation for this marriage. Part of what he does to do this is get the opinion of various theologians and scholars from England and across Europe to write on this matter. And I have an image here for you of this appeal that is sent by Wolsey to Pope Julius II. And you can see hanging on here all the various wax seals of all the various university departments, theology schools that offer their opinion on this matter. Note how tricky this argument is. He's trying to argue that the Pope, it was the previous Pope to Julius II, by the way, his predecessor had erred, had made a mistake in judgment in giving the dispensation. So Julius is in a very tricky position to decide on whether or not to admit some error in papal authority. And if we've reviewed our history, we know that that's something a pope is going to be very reluctant to do. In July of 1529, Julius II has died, and his successor is Clement VII, and he formally rejects Henry's appeal for divorce and declines to judge whether or not this was an erroneous marriage. Part of what's happening here is that Charles V, Catherine's nephew, had sacked Rome in an invasion and basically made Clement VII his prisoner and puppet. So obviously Clement is very reluctant to anger Charles anymore. This moment makes Henry start to rethink his allegiance to Rome. And he believes he has been betrayed by prelates. He believes he has been betrayed by the leaders of the church. And so he begins to look around for alternatives in 1529. This allows an evangelical circle to emerge around him, in particular because he marries Anne Boleyn as his second wife. And Anne Boleyn comes from a family that is sympathetic to evangelicalism, to these new Lutheran ideas. And they begin to persuade Henry to move against the various prelates in the church and to reform the abuses in the church. They argue that if Rome won't reform the abuses, then why doesn't this godly king reform abuses here in the Church of England? Part of what's happening here is in the background is a lot of humanist rhetoric also. Henry was deeply imbued with humanist ideals of the importance of reforming abuse of the church and the importance of having godly rulers who will help secure the purity and truth of the church as well. So Henry is kind of disposed from a couple of different directions to be willing at least to listen to the arguments coming from Anne Boleyn and her circle. Because of that, Anne Boleyn finds some openings, so she begins to introduce Henry to various anti-papal ideals. William Tyndale, in particular, writes several treatises attacking the papacy that we know Anne Boleyn gives to Henry to read. And Anne Boleyn also begins to operate as a patron of evangelicals in England, helping to fund and oversee the production of Bibles and nurturing and raising up various evangelicals into circles around Henry VIII, the most important of those being Thomas Cranmer. So over a period of years, this begins to accelerate. So in March of 1533, the previous Archbishop of Canterbury dies, Archbishop Wareham, and in his stead is elevated one of these people in the evangelical circle, Thomas Cranmer, and he is consecrated as Archbishop of Canterbury. As a piece of this then, Cranmer announces the annulment of the marriage with Catherine of Aragon, and then Anne Boleyn is declared the lawful wife of Henry, and she is crowned as queen on June 1st, 1533. This really begins to cement the split with Rome, because it's the Archbishop who does the annulling, not the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. Everything comes to a head the following year with the Act of Supremacy of 1534. This is a document that Thomas Cranmer composes along with Thomas Cromwell, who we'll meet in a little bit. And this is passed by Parliament, by the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And it declares that Henry is the supreme head over the Church of England on earth, with power to govern the church temporally. So the idea here is that Henry is there as head of the Church of England to correct the church from any errors or heresies and to further protect it should any more errors, abuses, or heresies arise. Most bishops support royal supremacy sort of out of compulsion. They are aware that they really have no good option with Henry but to support it, and they want to preserve some sort of stability for the English church. They don't have a clear idea that this means rejecting formally other kinds of Catholic doctrine. That comes later. They want to do the best they can to preserve the Church of England from being undermined any further. What we have here is the concept called royal supremacy, the notion that the monarch is the head over the Church of England in matters temporal. In terms of determining doctrine, that still goes with the bishops. The office of spiritual teaching, preaching goes with the bishops. But Henry has the right to appoint, to create legislation, to institute or revise various kinds of church practices. What we see then is that notion of two swords theory that we saw at play in the Middle Ages sort of gets coalesced into the figure of Henry, where Henry in some ways is placing the temporal sword above the spiritual sword. So many of these ideas we saw playing out in the late Middle Ages are now coming to a head here with Henry in England. Okay, we're going to stop here, let you digest some of this material. And the next video, we're going to move on and look at the ways in which reform begins to be implemented through the Church of England after the Act of Supremacy.